Welcome back to the Last Roll of the Week podcast with me, John from Red Dice Diaries. Hannah's still away at her relatives at the time of recording, so again, you're just stuck with me. And today, I'm going to be discussing one of the earliest books that I enjoyed reading when I got into this great hobby of ours. But first of all, cue the music. So as I said before the intro, I'm going to be talking about one of the first books I read when getting into this hobby. And now I can already hear some of you saying,
"Oh, here we go, son. John's going to tell that story about how we discovered Woofrup again."
And you're right, I do love that story. However, that's not the book I'm going to be talking about today. The book I'm going to be talking about today is called Fantasy Wargaming, Games with Magic and Monsters by Martin Hackett. I think it was published in about 1990, and I'm lucky enough to have a copy of this now because my lovely wife, getting tired of me banging on about this book, bought me a copy one year for my birthday. And let me preface this discussion about this book by saying you're going to hear me banging on about how much I love this book, and a lot of that's wrapped up in nostalgia for me because it's one of the first books on the sort of wider hobby that I read way back in the pre-internet days. I would go down to my local library, and this is one of the few books they had on the subject, and I must have taken out and read that book easily over a dozen times. And so, like I said, there's a big nostalgia factor there, but it is by no means a perfect book. It's a sort of confusing mishmash of discussions about wargaming and role-playing and sort of blending the two of them together, which by modern standards, when the two aspects of the hobby, wargaming and role-playing, have sort of separated off a bit more distinctly and everything's a little bit more categorized, it is a little bit more confusing and a little bit muddled, I suppose, for people with those modern sensibilities coming and having a look at it. However, for me, as a young teenager reading this book and seeing someone talking in a very conversational way about how they run their own fantasy games, including mass battles, but also dungeon delves, there's pictures of miniatures in it. I mean, stuff that I couldn't have even dreamed of or certainly not afforded back then. It really fired up my imagination. So I just want to talk a little bit about it today. So the book starts off with a few definitions of, what's wargaming, what's role-playing, etc. All familiar territory. However, it does feel quite fresh, as though the boundaries between them hadn't been so fully established back in the 90s. And it's quite amusing to see the author define them and then pretty much sort of ignore the boundaries between those things. But like I say, it's done in a very conversational style, and it's followed up by some examples of play where effectively the author's written a little story which describes some adventurers progressing through a dungeon and what they get up to. And it's all pretty entertaining stuff. It's accompanied by lots of black and white pictures of miniatures, and certainly the early history of the gaming that's detailed in the book focuses mainly on miniatures and how sort of miniature soldiers and war games developed. It talks about airfix, American Civil War sort of Union figures and stuff like that. And we get a whole chapter on the history of fantasy wargaming. There's some black and white pictures of the original white box D&D and the sort of advanced D&D Player's Handbook and Dungeon Master's Guide. And then there's a picture of the map of the world of Greyhawk and some other miniatures and stuff like that, including a particularly, to my mind, impressive Sussex Miniatures 25mm Balrog, which looks very nice. There's a little section on moral tales and education where we're obviously talking about, sort of satanic panic style, where people are sort of taking up in arms against depictions of the demonic and stuff like that. The author tries to sort of reassure people by pointing out the educational values and the harmless entertainment values that role-playing can offer, whilst also addressing some of the points that people who are objecting to it at the time bring up. Although it's not a particularly detailed view, it's only like 3 or 4 pages or something like that. We then go on to a discussion called the role of the controller, which is obviously the controller is the term they're using for GM in this book, and it's all pretty standard stuff nowadays. You know, the controller has the map, the background information, he's the master of the realm, he sets out the challenges for the player characters and stuff like that. But like I say, when I was a teenager and I didn't really have much of an idea about RPGs, and I was reading this, the very sort of basic nature of how this is set out and how it's put down in the book made it really accessible to me as a teenager who knew nothing about the hobby, and to be honest found it a bit intimidating wandering into the local game store full of old greybeards and dusty tomes lining the shelves. And it all sort of seemed quite intimidating and quite sort of closed off to me. Like, you know, I didn't really know anything about it, and it was quite sort of difficult to break in. Now, to be honest, as I found out later on, most of that was in my head. Most of the people at my local game store, unfortunately, no longer with us as a bricks and mortar store. But, you know, if you're going online, check out Spirit Games. It still exists as an online retailer. Most of the people there were absolutely, genuinely happy to get a newcomer involved in the hobby. Obviously the business is happy to sell you the books, etc. as well, but it was a great place. But taking that initial step was made a little bit less intimidating by this book, because reading it I felt like, oh, I've got a basic grasp of how things work. I'm not going in completely cold and completely ignorant to what the hobby involves. Looking back at it now, as someone who dabbled in Warhammer and Games Workshop stuff when I was younger, there's also a wealth of photos of like old Citadel miniatures. Like there's a Citadel miniature I'm looking at on a page now where it's a sort of Eastern style sorcerer on foot and on a magic carpet, and these are miniatures that had long since ceased to circulate by the time I sort of dabbled in that aspect of the hobby. So it's really interesting to look at this book, even if just from a historical aspect, so you can see the sort of viewpoints of a GM at the time, like I say, the early 90s, and also you can see some of these older artifacts from that time. Now, obviously, the 90s wasn't forever ago, and I can just about remember it, even with my poor memory, but it's still interesting to have a look at what the hobby was like before I really got into it. And this book covers a whole gamut from not just role-playing games, it talks about board games, it talks about wargaming clubs, solo adventure books, and it all just ties it up in a neatly, easily accessible sort of package. There are then chapters talking about miniatures, the sort of miniatures you can buy and use in fantasy. There's also advice on sort of, I suppose, scratch building miniatures for sort of like snakes, bubbling oozes, simple stuff like using modelling clay, etc. And you can tell this is from an era when there wasn't the plethora of fantasy miniatures options available that we have today. But also you can tell that the author sort of comes from a wargaming background. He's heavily sort of miniatures focused. And I know a lot of people nowadays say,
well, you don't really need miniatures at all. You can just do theatre of the mind stuff and just describe it, and it's absolutely fine. Miniatures aren't necessary.
And that's true to a certain extent. But like I say, the guy who wrote this book, Martin Hackett, you can tell that he comes from a miniature wargaming background, and he later sort of moved into RPGs, and that's what he knows, and that's what he feels more comfortable talking about. Next in the book, unsurprisingly, like I say, with him obviously coming from a wargaming background, Martin goes into talking about fantasy wargaming, and he's actually snuck what looks, from my admittedly sort of amateur perspective, to be a fully serviceable fantasy wargaming system into the book. Now, I've got to confess, I'm not really into the fantasy wargaming stuff, so I've never tried this system out, but I thought it was quite interesting to see the sort of process that he went through when he was creating these rules. It's one of the reasons I always like it when you have a sort of statement of authorial intent in an RPG. You have designer's notes, like there's a couple of Ben Milton's from Questing Beasts books that have designer notes in them, and I always love those because I like to see, even if I later plan on changing the game or how I run it, I love to see how the designers created it and how they envisioned it being played. It's a nice sort of peek behind the curtains. So I really enjoyed these chapters. And also, there's some great further pictures of miniatures in here, including a massive 25mm scale goblin war giant with loads of like goblins hanging from him. And I seem to remember back in the day there was one of them painted up in the front window of my local gaming store, and I always thought it looked absolutely beautiful. We have some very nice looking colour photographs in a small section in the centre. Again, mostly showing off miniatures, mostly fantasy, but also some sci-fi stuff. And then we go on to a chapter called Enhancing the Game, where the author says, armed with your complete set of fantasy game rules and painted figures, again that wargaming influence coming in, you will be able to explore strange forests and caverns or to fight mass battle. Your basic requirements are met and gaming can begin. But what can you do to improve the visual aspect of the game and at the same time make the game easier to follow and understand for new players? Can you associate it with a world that the players are investigating? So I love this because he's effectively talking about sort of building up a little bit of a narrative, a little bit of lore, a little bit of world background. He starts to explore dungeons and talk about how you can use acetate sheets, with like old China-graph pencils. For those of you who may not remember them, they effectively look like a black, or I presume they were different coloured, pencil crayon that if you got some clear plastic like acetate, you could draw on with this pencil and then you could wipe it off very easily afterwards. Now actually this is something back in the earliest days of gaming that I did try, inspired by this book. I essentially bought some sticky back plastic, props to Blue Peter for that, and stuck it down to a neutral grey cardboard. And then I got one of these China-graph pencils. Took me ages to find one in the town where I live, but eventually in the old Partners stationers, I managed to find a few. And of course, I had probably a handful of smattering of miniatures at the time, maybe from an old Hero Quest box or something that would probably be worth a fortune now if I still had it. But there you go, that's the benefit of hindsight. And I'd just draw out the dungeon area that people were exploring, and we'd just put marks on them, or we'd use little counters to represent the heroes and the monsters, and that worked really great for what it was. What then follows is essentially a load of tips and ideas for how to design terrain, which is all quite nice, before we move on to a series of prompts about creating your world, where the author talks about the geography of your world, settlements and their sort of placements, the various different races or species, whatever you want to call them, that might inhabit your world, having a reason for like treasure being dotted all over the place, monsters, stuff like that. And it's very brief, to be honest. Most of the advice in there, although good, is a little bit basic by today's standards, because obviously we now have whole books and series of books that talk about nothing more than generating worlds. In fact, I'm just rereading, because I've read it a couple of times, I'm reading How to Make a Fantasy Sandbox by Rob Conley, and that is a great book. Highly recommend that if you want to look at something on the more realistic side of things, the more in-depth side of things. I'm also reading the Tome of World Building from Mythmere Games, which is also a great book. And these are big, thick, chunky books that mainly deal with just that one subject. Whereas here, the author lightly touches on it because he's got a whole book of a gamut of different topics that he's got to cover. But there's some basic useful guidelines in there, although they're mainly slanted towards providing justification for a series of encounters or a perilous dungeon full of treasure. And to be honest, if that's your bag, and I quite enjoy that stuff myself, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What I also found interesting is it then moves on to talk about science fiction. And you can tell from reading this that sort of back in the day, science fiction role-playing wasn't such a thing. And to be honest, I know it's more of a thing now, but I still think it's vastly outweighed by the sheer amount of fantasy stuff that is available. And indeed, this chapter largely talks about repurposing fantasy tropes and stuff like that to use them with a sci-fi background. So, for instance, we've got a series of miniature photos on here where it shows some ancient Citadel Cybermen miniatures, which it says you could use as robots. And then it says, perhaps on one of your planets, dwarves fly on giant bats. And it's got a grenadier miniature talking about that. So obviously the idea is you're going to be travelling between planets. And on each planet, you can use it as justification for pretty much having whatever bizarre combinations of flora and fauna you want. We get some details on campaigns, and again it refers back to a lot of classics like Middle-earth role-playing, the old West End games, Star Wars and stuff like that. Before, again, sort of segueing into talking about miniatures and troops and all of the sort of things that go into a fantasy war game. Although this time it's mixed in with a system for trade, wealth, things like that, which potentially you could use to run the whole sort of background and all the stuff that's going on in your campaign world. How well it works, to be honest, I don't know, because it's a little bit more detailed than my tastes would tend to go for, especially for like a role-playing game. Although I think it sort of hews closer to the original sort of wargaming campaigns, which, as I've said, is no surprise. But again, it's all very interesting to read, and it really did capture my imagination as a teenager. We've got the appearance of random tables for like annual government event tables, noble encounters, stuff like that, random settlements. And I don't know how much use there'd be in RPGs today, to be perfectly honest, because we've got books and books of random tables. And I think obviously times have moved on a bit and people have created these newer books with the benefits of the experience that went before. But much as in the same way, certainly in the OSR, we look back to classic RPG books, you know, sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, as it were. I think it's really interesting to look back and see how this artifact from a different time, if you want to call it that, how the viewpoint then was different from ours when we look at RPGs today, but also the things that were the same. So like things like, there's a random table of events here where it's got things like, oh, a hamlet's attacked by a dragon, 20 militia are killed. There's a drought, 3 credits are lost. Westerly scouts discover a unit of 20 dryads that they befriend. 5 trolls from the nearest hills attack each hex until killed. And I don't think this is a million miles away from some of the sort of random wilderness tables that we have now. Okay, this deals slightly more on a sort of zoomed out kingdom level, but hey, we also have that style of play in RPGs. I mean, look at Adventurer Conquer King for stuff like that, if you really want to get into that sort of detail. So I don't think it's too far away from what we actually have now, and it's certainly interesting as a historical artifact. There's some great maps in there from the author. They're all simple sort of black and white, but they're really interesting as he details his own campaign world or a sample campaign world. And then we get to finally to a list, or to a conclusion basically, where he's sort of talking about his own opinion about D&D, fantasy role-playing. And even back then in this book, we hear a refrain that's so often echoed nowadays, where the author's like, hey, fantasy role-playing isn't just Dungeons and Dragons, you know. Now, how many times in the modern hobby have you heard people say that? And then we have appendices, where there's a list of fantasy role-playing games of the time, board games, figure suppliers, scenery suppliers, modern science fiction and other role-playing games, fantasy magazines. There's a random geographical generation table in there for some reason, which seems perfectly fine. And there's an appendix on solo game books, play-by-mail, and suggested reading. And then there's a few sort of reference sheets at the back for the fantasy wargaming system that was snuck in there earlier. So, in conclusion, is this a great book to buy now? Now, if you're looking for something that you can purely use and take stuff out of for your game, to be honest, no, it's probably not. Like I say, times have moved on. There's probably a lot easier to digest and a lot more sort of detailed and specialised books available nowadays. If, however, you got involved in the hobby in the 90s, or you were a youngster back then, like I was, and you were taking your first tentative steps into the hobby, then this book, Fantasy Wargaming, Games with Magic and Monsters by Martin Hackett, may bring a smile to your face. Now, I've had a quick look online, and you can find it for about £14.99. That's in British money. However, I've also seen it on eBay going for as low as £10 of British money, so you can pick up a copy fairly cheaply. It's a nicely put together book, and it provides a really interesting snapshot of the time period in which it was written. And given the current emphasis on gaming history and stuff like that, although admittedly the gaming history does seem to mainly be focused on Dungeons and Dragons, sort of seeing independent snapshots like this are really interesting. And like I say, for me, it's very nostalgic because it's one of the first books I read when I was starting to dip my little toe into the waters of the RPG hobby. So if that sounds interesting to you, get yourself online, see if you can find a cheap copy of Fantasy Wargaming Games of Magic and Monsters by Martin Hackett. If you do read it, if you've already got a copy and you've read it or you've read it before, let me know what you thought of the book. And like I say, it's not a perfect book by any means, but I'd love to hear what you thought about it. Are there any old school books like this from the early days of the RPG hobby that you'd like to recommend me? I mean, if they cost the earth, I'm not going to pick them up. But, you know, if there's some out there I can get hold of for not too expensive, I'd quite like to read them. So like I say, I find this stuff really interesting rather than the sort of reading actual things from the time rather than the sort of sanitized later sort of revisionist history that we tend to get in some, not all, books. So if you would like to leave me a message, please drop a voicemail to my SpeakPipe account. There's a link down below. Or you can send us an email at rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll maybe feature your voicemail in a future show. So thank you very much for listening. If you still are, go out there and play an RPG, or whatever RPG you're playing. I hope you have great fun. Take care, and we'll speak to you soon.